I never thought I would tell this story, but if you feel something is wrong in your marriage, trust that instinct. I lived a perfect lie for 5 years, believing I carried a cursed bloodline and my husband was my only savior. But the truth was exposed by a stranger in the emergency room. His words uncovered a cruel plot to steal a fortune of billions of dollars that I did not even know I owned. My name is Elena Vance. At 32 years old, I should have been sitting in a boardroom directing the future of the Vance Architecture Group, a billion-dollar empire my grandfather built from steel and ambition. Instead, I spent my days watching the fog roll over the hills of Silver Creek Valley through triple-paned glass, trapped in a body that felt less like a vessel and more like a cage. For 5 years, I had accepted my terrifying reality. I believed I was the tragic carrier of the Vance neurodegenerative syndrome, a rare and aggressive genetic curse that supposedly rotted the mind and withered the muscles. My husband, Dr. Adrian Hale, was the only reason I was still breathing. He was a brilliant neurologist, celebrated in medical journals and revered by his peers. But to me, he was simply my lifeline. Every morning at 8 o'clock sharp, the ritual began. I would sit on the edge of our silk-sheeted bed, and Adrian would prepare the silver syringe from his locked medical case. He called it the stabilizer. I called it the anchor that kept me from drifting away into total paralysis. Life in our secluded mansion was quiet, suffocatingly so. I was treated like a porcelain doll that had already begun to crack. I rarely left the grounds. The world outside was too loud, too chaotic, and filled with too many pathogens for my fragile system. Or so Adrian said. The isolation was absolute. Now, the stakes were even higher. I was 8 months pregnant. My belly was a heavy, miraculous swell against my wasting frame. The doctors called it a high-risk miracle. Adrian called it a gamble we had to win, a testament to his medical genius. But Adrian was not my only warden. His mother, Madeline Hale, had moved in 3 months ago to assist with the pregnancy. She was a woman of sharp angles and even sharper words, though she coated them in a thick veneer of concern. Every meal was inspected. Every calorie was counted. She would stand over me as I forced down bitter kale smoothies and strange herbal teas, her cold eyes tracking every swallow. She claimed she was protecting the heir, my unborn daughter. But I often felt she was merely fattening a prize pig for slaughter. The injections were getting harder to bear. 10 minutes after the needle pierced my skin, the room would tilt violently. Colors would bleed together, and a heavy numbness would creep up my fingertips until I could not feel the texture of the duvet. When I complained of the hallucinations, seeing shadows dance in the corners of the room or hearing whispers in the walls, Adrian would hold me close. He would whisper that this was necessary. He told me it was the harsh price for sanity, the only way to suppress the madness gene, the same dark inheritance that had claimed my mother. He spoke of her often. He painted vivid, terrifying pictures of my mother dying, screaming in a state sanitarium, her mind completely gone, consumed by violence and delusion. I had no memory of it, but Adrian remembered for me. He carried the burden of that history so I would not have to. I was terrified of becoming her. I would have done anything to avoid that fate, even if it meant living in a permanent, drug-induced fog. Yet, the fog had momentary breaks. Last week, I passed by Adrian's home laboratory. The door was slightly ajar, usually. He hummed while he worked, wearing his confident doctor's smile. But that day, he was silent. I saw him through the crack, mixing a vial with a frantic, sweating intensity. His jaw was clenched tight, and he looked at the beaker not with scientific curiosity, but with something that looked like fear. When he saw me, the mask slipped back on instantly, but the image of his trembling hands stayed with me. Then came the letter. It arrived yesterday, mixed in with a stack of architectural digests I was no longer allowed to read but liked to look at. It was a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was a single index card with scrawled handwriting that read simply, "Stop the blue medicine. It kills the mind." My heart hammered against my ribs. The liquid Adrian injected into me was a distinct, pale blue. Before I could process it, Adrian appeared behind me and snatched the paper from my hand. He crumpled it without reading it, laughing softly. He told me it was just junk mail, some cruel conspiracy nonsense targeting wealthy families. He kissed my forehead and led me back to bed, but for the first time in 5 years, his touch felt cold. The house felt impossibly large and quiet the moment Adrian's car disappeared down the driveway. He had been summoned to New York for an emergency medical conference, leaving me in the strict care of his mother, Madeline, and Sarah, a private nurse he had hired 2 months ago. Sarah was timid and followed Adrian's instructions with religious fervor, but Madeline was the true warden. Late that afternoon, the sky turned a bruised purple, signaling a massive storm coming in from the coast. Madeline marched into the sunroom where I was resting and placed a steaming cup of tea on the table. The liquid was a murky brown and smelled pungent, like wet earth and old pennies. She insisted it was an ancient herbal blend to strengthen the uterus. I nodded obediently, but the moment she turned to adjust the heavy velvet curtains, I poured the scalding liquid into the soil of a large potted fern. It was a small, petty act of rebellion, but it gave me a strange thrill to defy her. By dinner, the storm had broken over the valley with violent intensity, shaking the window panes in their frames. We ate a simple meal prepared by the staff, but within an hour, I was doubled over in agony. It was not the rhythmic tightening of contractions. This was a sharp, twisting knife in my stomach. I was vomiting violently, and my vision blurred. Sarah was in a panic. She tried to call Adrian, but the storm had knocked out the cell towers, and the landline was dead. When the power cut out, plunging the mansion into darkness, Sarah made a frantic executive decision. She could not risk waiting. She loaded me into the back of the SUV and drove through the blinding rain. Because the roads to our private family clinic were flooded, she was forced to head to the nearest facility, St. Jude's Hospital. It was a crowded, underfunded public hospital that Adrian would have never allowed me to set foot in. The emergency room was a chaotic swirl of fluorescent lights and shouting voices. I was quickly wheeled into a curtained bay, shivering and terrified. That was when I met Dr. Lucas Trent. He looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes and a stethoscope hanging loosely around his neck. He did not know my name. He did not know about the Vance fortune. To him, I was just a terrified pregnant woman in pain. He immediately ordered a full blood panel and an emergency MRI to rule out appendicitis or placental abruption. I lay in the narrow hospital bed for what felt like hours, listening to the beep of the monitor. Finally, Dr. Trent returned. The casual fatigue was gone from his face, replaced by a deep, furrowed frown. He held a clipboard tight against his chest and pulled the stool close to my bedside. He asked me to walk him through my medical history again. I took a breath and recited the script I had memorized over the last 5 years. I told him about the Vance neurodegenerative syndrome. I explained how it ate away at my nerves and how my husband had to manage my care to keep the symptoms at bay. Dr. Trent stared at me for a long moment. He did not nod. He did not take notes. He stood up and walked over to the computer terminal in the corner of the room. He typed furiously for a minute, the blue light of the screen reflecting in his glasses. Then he turned back to me, his expression a mix of confusion and pity. He told me that he had just searched the National Medical Database and the Global Registry of Rare Diseases. My heart stopped as he spoke the next words. He said there was no record of any disease called Vance neurodegenerative syndrome. It simply did not exist. Dr. Trent moved to the door and slid the glass panel shut, clicking the lock with a deliberate snap. The sounds of the busy emergency room were instantly muffled, leaving us in a heavy, terrifying silence. He walked back to my bedside, his voice lowered but filled with an intensity that made my skin prickle. He looked me straight in the eyes and told me that my symptoms did not come from any genetic disease. He said they were not the result of a failing nervous system or a cursed bloodline. Then he said the words that would shatter my entire world. He told me, "It did not come from you." He explained that the poison in my system was introduced from the outside. My breath caught in my throat. I tried to argue, my voice trembling as I explained that my husband gave me injections to save me, not to hurt me. I told him about the stabilizer. Dr. Trent shook his head firmly. He held up the toxicology report. He told me that my blood was saturated with high levels of scopolamine and a potent muscle relaxant that had been banned for human use years ago. He explained that the combination was designed to induce hallucinations, memory loss, and physical weakness. It was not medicine. It was a chemical leash designed to keep me weak, pliable, and confused. I felt the room spin, but this time it was not the drugs. It was the sheer weight of the betrayal. I stammered about the baby, repeating Adrian's warnings that there was a 50% chance our child would inherit the madness. I grabbed the doctor's arm, begging for the truth about my daughter. Dr. Trent's expression softened for the first time. He told me the baby was perfectly healthy. There were no genetic markers for any syndrome because the syndrome did not exist. The baby was fine. I was the one being slowly erased. Then he dropped the final hammer. He asked me why I believed my mother died of insanity. I repeated the story Adrian had drilled into me, that she died screaming in a padded room, a victim of her own broken mind. Dr. Trent turned the monitor screen toward me. He had pulled up the state death records, which were public domain. There it was, in black and white. Victoria Vance. Cause of death was blunt force trauma from an automobile accident. She had not died in an asylum. She had died on a highway. A cold realization washed over me. My mother, the woman I had been terrified of becoming, was just the first victim. Adrian had rewritten her history to make me afraid of my own shadow. He had used her memory as a weapon to control me. I felt a scream building in my chest, a mix of grief for the mother I never really knew and rage at the husband I thought I loved. Before I could unleash that scream, the glass door to the room was thrown open. Madeline Hale marched in, her face a mask of furious indignation, with Nurse Sarah trailing behind her like a frightened ghost. Madeline demanded to know why I was in a public facility. She shouted that they were transferring me immediately to the Hale private clinic. She did not even look at me. She looked at the machines, at the doctor, at everything but the daughter-in-law she was supposedly protecting. A chaotic argument erupted. Dr. Trent stood his ground, stating that I was his patient and he had not authorized a discharge. Madeline countered with legal threats, waiving her power of attorney papers that Adrian had forced me to sign years ago. While they screamed at each other, Dr. Trent moved close to the bed, ostensibly to check my vitals one last time. In that split second of distraction, he pressed a small folded piece of paper and a business card into my palm. He whispered for me to hide them. I clenched my fist tight, feeling the sharp corner of the card against my skin. Just as Madeline grabbed the other side of the bed and ordered Sarah to prepare me for transport. I was going back to the prison, but for the first time in 5 years, I was bringing a weapon with me. The ride back to the mansion was silent and suffocating. When we arrived, Madeline confiscated my phone, citing strict orders for total rest, effectively cutting off my only line of communication with the outside world. Adrian called the landline an hour later. His voice was not the soothing baritone I was used to. It was sharp and jagged. He scolded me like a naughty child for going to a public hospital, ranting about the risks of exposure and how I had humiliated him. I listened and apologized, forcing my voice to tremble. I had to become the actress of my life. I had to be the broken, dependent Elena he created, or I knew I would never survive long enough to escape. For the next 2 days, I played the role of the invalid perfectly. When Nurse Sarah brought my midday medication, a cocktail of pills Adrian had prescribed for my anxiety while he was away, I placed them under my tongue. I swallowed the water, gave her a weak, vacant smile, and waited for her to turn her back before spitting the dissolving paste into a tissue hidden in my sleeve. The withdrawal was physical and brutal, shaking my hands and making my skin itch. But the mental clarity that followed was worth every second of pain. The fog that had shrouded my brain for 5 years began to lift. I could see colors sharply again. I could remember what I had for breakfast. I could think. On the second night, with the house asleep and the storm finally past, I crept down the hallway to Adrian's study. The heavy oak door creaked, but the house remained silent. I went straight to the wall safe behind the painting of the fox hunt. I did not know the combination, but a strange instinct guided my hand. I dialed in the date of my mother's birth. The woman Adrian claimed was a lunatic. The lock clicked open. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pulled the heavy steel door open. I expected to find stacks of cash or jewelry. Instead, I found a mountain of paperwork. There were legal documents for something called the Vance Family Trust and a thick medical file with my mother's name on it. I sat on the floor and read by the light of the moon. My mother had never been insane. The medical reports were clean, but the will was the smoking gun. It stated clearly that full control of the Vance Architecture Group would pass to me the moment I gave birth to my first heir. Until then, it was held in trust. I flipped through the pages, my hands shaking with rage. There were documents granting Adrian and Madeline power of attorney over my finances due to my mental incapacitation. They had invented a disease to declare me unfit so they could control the money until the baby arrived. But the final document made my blood run cold. It was a life insurance policy taken out on me 6 months ago. The payout was astronomical, $50 million. The terms were specific. It paid out in full in the event of my death due to childbirth complications. The puzzle pieces slammed together into a horrific picture. I was not a wife to him. I was an incubator. They needed me to carry the baby to term because the child was the key to unlocking the trust. Once the baby was born, I became a liability. Their plan was simple and terrifying. I was going to die in that delivery room, a tragic victim of my fragile constitution, and Adrian would be left as the grieving widower, the sole guardian of the heir, and the king of my empire. The next morning, under the pretense of needing fresh air for the baby, I walked to the dilapidated gardening shed at the edge of the property. Buried beneath a pile of rusted shears and old terracotta pots, I found what I was looking for. It was a cracked, prepaid smartphone that one of the landscapers had lost months ago. I had found it back then but kept it hidden, a subconscious survival instinct I had not understood until now. My hands trembled as I charged it with a portable battery pack I had swiped from the kitchen drawer. I dialed the number on the business card Dr. Trent had pressed into my hand at the hospital. He answered on the first ring. Trent did not waste time. He told me he had contacted a lawyer who was eager to speak with me. Her name was Harper Vance. The name sent a jolt through me. Harper was my second cousin, a brilliant litigator whom Adrian had banned from our wedding. He had called her a jealous vulture who wanted my inheritance, but I now realized he had feared her because she was the only one smart enough to see through his charade. We arranged a meeting for midnight at the back of the estate, where the high-tech security fence had a blind spot caused by a fallen oak tree that Adrian had been too cheap to repair. The grass was wet with dew as I slipped out of the patio doors. In the shadows of the tree line, I saw 2 figures. Dr. Trent looked anxious, scanning the horizon for guards, but Harper Vance looked like a soldier ready for war. She held my hands tightly, her grip grounding me. Then she told me the ugly truth about my husband. Adrian was not just a controlling narcissist. He was a desperate criminal. Harper had done a forensic audit of the few company accounts she could access. Adrian had embezzled millions from the Vance Architecture Group. He was not investing it. He was gambling it away. He owed staggering amounts of money to a loan shark syndicate in Atlantic City. They had given him a deadline, and that deadline coincided perfectly with my due date. He needed the inheritance not just for greed, but to save his own life. I wanted to run right then and there. I wanted to climb into Harper's car and never look back. But Harper shook her head. She explained that if I ran now, Adrian would use his medical credentials to claim I was having a psychotic break. The police would drag me back, and he would lock me away in a facility where no one could reach me. We needed undeniable proof. Dr. Trent handed me a small velvet pouch. Inside were 6 micro-recording devices, each no larger than a button. I had to be the spy in my own home. I had to get them on tape confessing to the plan. The next day was a nerve-wracking game of cat and mouse. I moved through the house like a phantom. I stuck one recorder under the mahogany dining table using double-sided tape. I hid another behind a row of medical journals in Adrian's study. I even managed to slip one into the pocket of his lab coat hanging by the door. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a gunshot to my ears, but I forced myself to keep moving. However, my sudden burst of energy did not go unnoticed. That evening, Madeline watched me closely across the dinner table. Her eyes narrowed as she noted that my hands were steady and my speech was clear. She remarked coldly that I seemed unusually alert for someone with my condition. She suggested to Adrian that perhaps my dosage needed to be increased immediately to prevent a relapse. I saw Adrian reach for his medical bag, and panic surged in my chest. If they drugged me now, I would lose the clarity I needed to escape. I had to improvise. As Adrian approached with the syringe, I let out a ragged gasp. I dropped my fork, letting it clatter loudly against the china, and threw myself backward in the chair. I convulsed, mimicking the violent seizures I had suffered for years under their care. I let my eyes roll back and my body thrash against the floor. It was a humiliating performance, but it worked. Adrian pulled back, looking relieved that his poison was still doing its job. He told his mother that the disease was progressing as expected and there was no need for an extra dose yet. But my performance had an unintended consequence. Later that night, the recorder I had hidden in the study captured a chilling conversation. I listened to it on the hidden phone with earbuds pressed tight to my ears. Adrian sounded frantic. He told Madeline that my body was breaking down faster than anticipated and he could not risk waiting for natural labor. He said he was going to induce labor this weekend, right there in the house. They were moving the timeline up. I had less than 48 hours before they cut me open to steal my child and end my life. The air in the dining room was so thick with tension I could practically taste the metallic tang of adrenaline on my tongue. Adrian and Madeline had set the table with our finest bone china, but the guest of honor was not a friend. It was their family attorney, a man who looked at me not as a person, but as a collection of assets to be liquidated. They were finalizing the paperwork for the transfer of the Vance estate, discussing the contingencies of my death with the casual indifference of people discussing the weather. I sat there, my hands resting protectively over my swollen belly, listening to them carve up my legacy while I was still breathing. The recorder taped beneath the table was running, capturing every rustle of paper and every damning word. I needed more than just financial greed. I needed a confession of murder. I took a sip of water, my hand trembling just enough to sell the act, and looked at Adrian. I asked him softly if my mother had made these same arrangements before she lost her mind. I asked if she had been as scared as I was. The wine and the arrogance of imminent victory had loosened Adrian's tongue. He swirled his Cabernet and let out a short, cruel laugh. He looked me in the eye and told me that the old woman was brilliant, but she made the fatal mistake of trusting the wrong person. He admitted with a chilling smile that he only needed to alter a few lines in her medical records to make her sanity disappear. He said it was that easy. Madeline did not scold him for his indiscretion. Instead, she leaned forward, her diamond earrings catching the candlelight. She told me to stop asking questions. She said that just like my mother, I was merely a vessel. She told me that once the baby was born, my purpose on this earth was finished. I felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with my pregnancy, but I forced myself to remain still. I knew the tiny device under the table was streaming every syllable of their monstrous admission directly to Harper's secure cloud server. We had them. I feigned a sharp gasp of pain, clutching my side. I apologized and said I needed to lie down. Adrian waved his hand dismissively, too focused on the signature line of the document to care. I walked out of the room with heavy steps, but the moment I hit the landing, I moved with silent speed. I rushed to my room and pulled the hidden bundle from the back of the closet. It contained my passport, the cash I had scavenged, and the hard drive with the files from the safe. I was ready to run. Downstairs. The atmosphere shifted violently. I heard the distinct sound of the kitchen trash can being kicked over. Then came Adrian's voice, rising in a roar of disbelief. He had found the vial. I had been careless. I had poured the morning's injection into the trash, thinking the tissues would soak it up, but the glass vial itself was still full of the clear blue poison. He knew. He knew I had not taken the medicine. Heavy footsteps thundered up the stairs. I barely had time to shove the documents under my shirt before the bedroom door flew open. Adrian stood there. The refined doctor was gone. In his place was a wild-eyed predator. He did not say a word. He walked to the landline on the nightstand and ripped the cord out of the wall. Then he turned the lock on the bedroom door, the click echoing like a gunshot in the silence. He looked at me with a terrifying calmness and told me that we were done waiting. He said the surgery would begin tonight. Adrian was not preparing for a birth. He was preparing for an execution. Through the locked bedroom door, I could hear the distinct, terrifying clatter of metal instruments being arranged on a steel tray in the medical suite down the hall. He intended to cut my baby out of me and let me bleed to death on the table, blaming it on a tragic hemorrhage caused by my weak constitution. I did not have time to be afraid. I grabbed the heavy crystal vase from the mantel and swung it with every ounce of strength I possessed against the double-paned window. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, letting the storm howl into the room. The wind whipped the curtains around me as I climbed onto the wet sill. I looked down. It was a 20-foot drop to the muddy flower beds below. A woman with a degenerative muscle disease could never make this climb. But I was not that woman. I reached for the copper drain pipe running down the side of the house. It was slick with rain, but my grip was iron. I slid down, the rough metal tearing the skin on my palms, and landed hard in the mud. I scrambled to my feet instantly, adrenaline masking the pain in my ankles. Above me, the light in the broken window flicked on. Madeline stuck her head out, her hair wild in the wind. She screamed for the security team. Her voice was shrill and pierced through the thunder. I saw flashlight beams slice through the darkness of the garden as the private guards began to swarm the grounds. I did not look back. I sprinted toward the dense line of pine trees that bordered the estate. Branches whipped against my face, scratching my cheeks, but I kept running. Suddenly, a pain ripped through my lower back that brought me to my knees. It was not the dull ache of the poison. It was a rhythmic, tightening vice that squeezed my entire abdomen. The stress and physical exertion had triggered active labor. I groaned, clutching a tree trunk for support, breathing through the wave of agony. I had to keep moving. If they caught me now, I was dead. I forced myself upright and stumbled toward the rear of the property, where the old gardening shed stood. I prayed to a God I had not spoken to in years as I reached the rusted door of the shed. Inside was an old pickup truck the groundskeeper used for hauling mulch. I yanked the driver's side door open and checked the ignition. The keys were there. I turned them, and the engine sputtered before roaring to life. I threw the truck into reverse and tore out of the shed, smashing through the wooden doors just as two guards ran into the clearing. I hit the winding canyon road that led out of Silver Creek Valley. The asphalt was a black mirror, slick with oil and rain. I gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, fighting to keep the heavy truck on the road. In my rearview mirror, blinding xenon headlights appeared. It was Adrian's silver sports car. He was faster, and he was a better driver. He closed the gap in seconds, riding my bumper. I fumbled for the burner phone with one hand and dialed Dr. Trent. He answered on the first ring. I shouted over the roar of the engine that I was out, but the baby was coming. He told me not to go to the hospital because Adrian would have the police waiting there. He directed me to the old Vance Architecture headquarters in the city. He said the building had an independent biometric security system that only I could override, and a medical team was meeting us there. Adrian pulled up alongside me in the oncoming lane, ignoring the blind curves. He swerved hard, slamming the side of his expensive car into the rusted door of my truck. Metal shrieked against metal, sending sparks flying into the rain. He rolled down his window, his face twisted in a mask of pure rage. He screamed that I was stealing his property. He was not talking about the truck. He was talking about the air and the fortune inside my belly. I saw a construction sign ahead flashing yellow. It marked a detour for a bridge repair that had been stalled for months. I knew the layout from the company blueprints. The road ended in a massive pit of wet cement and mud. I maintained my speed, letting Adrian think I was trying to outrun him. At the very last second, I feigned a turn to the left, then jerked the wheel violently to the right, slamming on the brakes. Adrian, blinded by greed and momentum, could not correct his course. He shot past me, crashing through the orange barricades. I watched as his taillights launched into the air before diving nose first into the deep, sludge-filled construction pit, his car instantly immobilized in the muck. The tires of the battered truck screeched to a halt in front of the Vance Architecture headquarters. It was a towering monolith of steel and reinforced glass that my mother had designed 20 years ago. To the world, it was just an office building. But to me, it was a sanctuary. Harper and Dr. Trent were already there, flanked by a team of 3 private nurses who moved with military precision. They rushed me out of the truck and through the biometric scanners. The doors hissed shut behind us, locking out the storm and the nightmare I had just escaped. For the first time in my life, the heavy silence of the lobby did not feel like isolation. It felt like protection. We did not have time to set up a proper sterile room. My contractions were coming in waves that crashed over me every 2 minutes, leaving me breathless. They wheeled me into the main conference room on the top floor. It was fitting, in a way. This was the room where my mother had built her empire, and it was where I would bring the next generation of it into the world. They laid me on a makeshift bed atop the massive mahogany table, surrounded by the panoramic view of the city lights blinking through the rain. But Adrian was not done. From my vantage point, I saw flashing red and blue lights swarm the plaza below. He had called the police. I could hear his voice amplified by a megaphone, distorted but unmistakable. He was spinning a new web of lies to the officers. He claimed I had been kidnapped by a deranged lover, pointing the finger at Dr. Trent, and that I was in the middle of a psychotic episode that endangered my life and the baby. He was playing the terrified husband to perfection, weaponizing his medical authority to turn the law against me. Harper looked out the window, her face hard. She told Trent to focus on the delivery while she handled the wolves at the door. She marched down to the lobby to meet the police, armed not with weapons but with injunctions and the fierce authority of a top-tier litigator. She stood between the glass doors and the SWAT team, stalling them, demanding warrants, and refusing to let them breach the perimeter of a private building. Upstairs, the pain was tearing me apart. It felt like my hips were being pulled apart by rusty chains. One of the nurses offered me an epidural or a sedative to take the edge off, but I shook my head violently. For 5 years, I had been numbed. I had been sedated, drugged, and detached from my own body. I did not want to miss a single second of this. I wanted to feel the pain because the pain was real. It was proof that I was alive, that my muscles were working, and that I was fighting. I gritted my teeth and told them no. Dr. Trent held my gaze. He did not look at me with the condescending pity Adrian always had. He looked at me with respect. He gripped my shoulder and told me to listen to him. He said my body was stronger than I thought. He reminded me that I was not sick and that I never had been. He told me to push, to prove them wrong with every ounce of strength I had. The noise outside escalated. I could hear Adrian screaming my name, demanding to be let in to save his wife. The sirens wailed in a chaotic harmony, but I closed my eyes and tuned it all out. I focused on the rhythm of my own heart and the voice of the doctor guiding me. I pushed with a primal ferocity, channeling every year of suppressed rage and every drop of stolen vitality into this one moment. Then, the pressure vanished, replaced by a sudden, slippery warmth. The room went silent for a heartbeat, suspended in time. And then, a sound shattered the tension more effectively than any hammer. It was a cry, high, strong, and indignant. Dr. Trent lifted a small, wriggling bundle into the air. It was a girl. She was pink, furious, and perfect. Her cry echoed off the glass walls of the conference room, louder than the storm, louder than the police sirens, and certainly louder than the lies of the man standing on the street below. I was not broken. I was a mother, and I had won. I wrapped the hospital blanket tightly around my daughter, feeling her tiny heart beat against my chest. The exhaustion was heavy, pulling at my eyelids, but the adrenaline in my veins was hotter and stronger. I looked at Harper, who was standing by the electronic lock of the conference room doors. She looked at me with a question in her eyes. I nodded once, sharp and decisive. I told her to open the doors. I told her to let them all in. The heavy glass doors slid open with a mechanical hum. Instantly, the chaos of the hallway spilled into our sanctuary. Adrian burst into the room first, his hair disheveled and his tie askew. He was followed closely by Madeline and a phalanx of uniformed police officers, their hands resting on their holsters. Adrian scanned the room, his eyes landing on me and the bundle in my arms. He immediately dropped his shoulders, transforming into the picture of a terrified, relieved husband. He rushed toward me, his hands outstretched, tears already gleaming in his eyes. He cried out to God, thanking him that I was safe. He looked at the officers and said that his poor wife was delusional and hurting their child. He reached for the baby, cooing that Daddy was there to save her. I took a step back. I did not cower. I did not tremble. I stood tall, my spine straight for the first time in 5 years. I looked him dead in the eye and spoke with a voice that could cut glass. I told him not to touch her. I told him not to touch her with his filthy hands. The venom in my voice stopped him in his tracks. The room went deadly silent. Madeline seized the moment to escalate the drama. She pushed past a police officer, pointing a shaking, manicured finger at Dr. Trent and Harper. She shrieked that they were kidnappers. She accused them of brainwashing a mentally unstable woman and forcing me to give birth in an office building. She demanded that the police arrest them immediately and return her grandchild to the safety of the Hale estate. I looked at Harper and gave the signal. Harper didn't say a word. She simply pressed a single key on her laptop, which was connected to the massive presentation screen that dominated the north wall of the conference room. The screen flickered to life. It was not a presentation. It was a video. The footage was grainy but unmistakable. It showed Adrian in his lab, his face illuminated by the harsh light of a burner, mixing the blue liquid with a look of cold, calculated malice. Then, the audio track cut in. It was the recording from dinner just 24 hours ago. Adrian's voice boomed through the surround sound speakers, clear and undeniable. The entire room heard him admit that my mother was brilliant but trusted the wrong person. They heard him brag about fixing her medical records to erase her sanity. Then Madeline's voice joined the chorus, calling me a vessel and stating that my purpose would end once the baby was born. The color drained from Adrian's face so fast he looked like a corpse. He looked at the screen, then at the police, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The police chief, a burly man who had been ready to handcuff Dr. Trent, froze. He held up a hand to stop his officers. He looked at Adrian with a new, dangerous scrutiny. The audio continued to play, detailing their plan to fake my death during childbirth to claim the insurance money. The silence that followed the recording was heavier than the storm outside. Dr. Trent stepped forward into that silence. He handed a thick manila folder to the chief. He explained that it was an independent toxicology report he had run on my blood sample from the emergency room. He stated clearly that I did not have any degenerative disease. He told them the report proved I had been chronically poisoned with high doses of scopolamine and illegal muscle relaxants for 5 years to induce symptoms of paralysis and psychosis. Adrian tried to stammer a defense, claiming the audio was doctored, that it was all a misunderstanding. But Harper had one final card to play. The side door to the conference room opened, and an older woman stepped inside. It was Mrs. Higgins, the housekeeper Adrian had fired the week after my wedding. She walked in with her head held high. She pointed a trembling finger at Adrian and told the police she saw him. She witnessed him burning my mother's real medical files in the fireplace the night after her funeral. She said she had tried to tell the family lawyer, but Adrian had threatened her life. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and said she was ready to testify. The trap had snapped shut, and the rats were finally caught. The room descended into chaos. But for once, I was the calm eye of the storm. Adrian began to sweat profusely, his facade of the concerned doctor crumbling into dust. He tried to argue that the recordings were taken out of context. He claimed his protocol was a radical, experimental treatment meant to save my life, not end it. He was grasping at straws, desperate to maintain the illusion of control. But Harper Vance stepped forward with a smile that was sharp enough to cut skin. She informed him that since I had successfully delivered a living heir, the Vance Family Trust had automatically triggered its protection clause. The accounts were frozen. The assets were locked. Adrian was not just a criminal. He was destitute. That reality broke Madeline. She let out a feral shriek that sounded nothing like the poised socialite she pretended to be. Her eyes rolled back in pure greed and madness. She snatched a heavy silver letter opener from the conference table and lunged at me. She screamed that I was not deserving of that money and that it belonged to her. The old Elena, the drugged and weak Elena, would have frozen. But I was not her anymore. I sidestepped her clumsy attack with a reflex speed I had forgotten I possessed. I grabbed the fire extinguisher mounted on the wall and swung it in a tight arc. The heavy metal canister connected with her shoulder, knocking her to the ground before she could take another step. The police swarmed them instantly. The sound of handcuffs ratcheting shut was the sweetest melody I had ever heard. It was the sound of an ending. As they dragged Adrian toward the door, he looked back at me one last time. He looked pathetic. He begged me to understand, claiming he did everything for us. I looked at him with zero emotion. I told him there was no us. I told him there was only me and my daughter. I told him he was just a malignant tumor that I had finally cut out of my body. 6 months have passed since that night in the glass tower. The trial was swift and brutal. The evidence was overwhelming. Adrian and Madeline were both sentenced to life in prison for conspiracy to commit murder, grand larceny, and practicing medicine without a license. They will rot in a cell, far away from the luxury they would have killed to keep. I made changes too. I erased the name Adrian had chosen for the baby. I named her Victoria, after my mother, to honor the woman who saved me from beyond the grave. I took my rightful place as the CEO of Vance Architecture. My first act was to fire every single board member who had enabled Adrian's gambling addiction and looked the other way. Then I established the Victoria Vance Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to helping victims of medical gaslighting and domestic abuse. I wanted to make sure no other woman would ever be made to feel crazy for trusting her own body. Tonight, I stand on the rooftop terrace of the office building, holding little Victoria in my arms. The city lights of Silver Creek twinkle below us, but I am not afraid of the dark anymore. My hands are steady. My mind is sharp. The fog is gone forever. I look down at my daughter's sleeping face and whisper to her that she is safe. I tell her that this strength does not just come from me, it comes from her grandmother too. We are the Vance women, and we do not break. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to hear your thoughts. So please leave a comment below telling me where you are tuning in from and what you would have done in my shoes. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to the channel Lily Revenge Stories, like this video, and hit that notification bell to help this story reach more people who might need to hear it.